Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our great sponsors, Your Dolce Vita, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abitativa Casa. And today my guest is Andrew Martin, who has a great podcast of his own dedicated to genealogy. So welcome, Andrew. Thanks for being here.
Hello, Bob. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, and we spoke a couple of weeks ago when I was a guest on your show. So we're going to follow up and get people to know your show, hopefully. So before we start, the first and most important question is, what is the name of your podcast?
The name of my podcast is, handily, the Family Histories Podcast.
Yes, and it's a great podcast. It is. A little bit switch for me because typically we go into, we talk about Italian genealogy, but to me, all genealogy is important. And, my kids are adopted. So my daughter has a lot of English and French roots, and my son has some Spanish and Puerto Rican roots. So it's always great to talk about these mixtures. So I'd like to ask you, because I know you have a unique way of starting your interview. So why don't you talk? I know you have like 3 components of the interview. So why don't you tell people about how that works?
Well, the Family Histories Podcast is currently recording its 8th series, and the format of each episode is pretty much the same, where I have a guest on and I interview them for about 20 minutes in the first part. Then there's a middle part where they tell a life story of someone that they find fascinating in the middle section of the show for about 20 minutes again. And then the third part of the show, they share one of their brick walls. And we've all got really irritating, annoying, lingering, pesky brick walls. So they get to, almost like with blogging, where you do what some people call cousin bait, where you write about your brick wall and then maybe in years and years in the future, someone will message you, go, oh, we're related, and it will solve your brick wall. But this is in a podcast, an audio format. So you hear the guest share their brick wall. They kind of say where they've got up to, maybe some of what they've tried to solve, and they kind of leave the listeners with a little challenge at the end of the episode. And when that bit's done, I avoid the usual, what I feel is usual, slightly awkward ending to a podcast episode of, yeah, thanks for coming on. Oh, no, it's great. Oh, you hang up. No, you hang up, that kind of thing. And I script a little set of lines. And for the listeners, it sounds like they are following me through to my garage, where we unveil a time machine. And I pop the guest into my secret time machine and I zap them back in time so they can go and solve their brick wall for themselves. Or at least that's what it sounds like, because I have lots of sound effects and funny lines to say. And it just ends with the guest being zapped and the listeners can imagine what happened next.
That was a really fun ending. It was certainly interesting and different because I end, like you said, goodbye, you hang up. So it is, it is.
There's nothing wrong with that.
What prompted you to start the series in the first place?
Well, I started it in 2021, and in the UK, we'd had a series of lockdowns because of obviously COVID pandemic. And I woke up one February morning, a nice morning, which is quite unusual for February here, but I woke up and I just thought I'm going to do a podcast. And I thought, what do I need to do this? And I realized I already had the equipment. So I had this microphone and the pop shield and the computer that could do it. And I thought, okay, I've got a kind of creative format that I could do with this time machine and the life story and the brick wall. And I knew that I could do that based on that format and that equipment. But then I think there's also an element, because we'd been through a pandemic and because we'd had gone through all of these lockdowns and I lived by myself, I think there was probably an element of kind of loneliness in this as well, and so it was a way of solving that as well. It enabled me to talk to people I'd never spoken to, like yourself, Bob, and a whole load of other guests that I've had on the show. So it kind of solved all of those things, gave me a creative output and a bit of fun, and got me speaking to people.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that book, because people say to me, "How do you just find these people and you just talk to people you don't know?" And to me, I
Yeah.
find that so interesting. So how do you find your guests? I know how I find the guests. I go around and pester people, but how do you find your guests?
Gosh, don't tell my mum I talk to strangers. Gosh, she'll be going crazy. It's like against all the parenting advice you could ever give. Uh, I literally talk to strangers. No, in the first series, I asked, I mean, there's 7 episodes per series, or maybe I should say season, because I think American audiences certainly would go for seasons rather than series. But 7 episodes in a season. And I think in that first season, I asked probably about 3 people that I knew, and those people were ones that I had met in person at conferences like the Who Do You Think You Are events in London and Birmingham and the genealogy shows and things like that. People that I knew and that I had got to know through social media, particularly through Twitter, and a little bit through Facebook as well. So I knew some of them, and then because I am quite active on Twitter, a long time before having this podcast, I was just kind of picking up on different topics and different people and trying to identify what kind of things that they seem to specialize in, or what kind of areas do they research in typically that were maybe different from how I research or the areas that I research in. So I was using that, and then I just reached out to them. And for those 7 guests in that first series, they were very brave. That's all I can say for me to say, "Hey, would you like to be on this podcast?" Most of you don't have a clue who I am. We've never spoken before. We've never met before. And there's a weird format. And I'm going to script you some lines, which I want you to say back to me. And I'm going to zap you back in time. And they all very thankfully said yes. And I recorded with them. So, and since then, it's got a little bit easier because there are some people who come to me and say, "Andrew, I'd like to be on your show. I'd really like to be a guest." I get publishers come to me and say, "Oh, we've got an author whose book's coming out," and that kind of thing. And so I kind of field these different requests as well as my wish list, which is quite long for guests, and approach them directly. So it's a bit of a mixture based on the kind of combination of different stories I think I'm going to get for a series.
Yeah, and I started pretty much the same way. I went out to friends or a couple of relatives just to practice it. And when I go
Yeah.
back and listen to the first ones, I'm like, oh my God, I was horrible. And I would talk too much. My wife told me, "You talk too much. You need to let the guests talk." So I've kind of grown into it. If you want to look at it that way. So let's talk
Bob,
about
you're doing very well as one host to another, Bob. You're doing very well. And it is difficult if you're a host being on someone else's podcast to shut up and listen. It is very tough to do that.
No, I hear you. I hear you. So let's talk about the components, because I think the way you structured it is pretty neat. So let's talk about the interview and some of the guests. What if you could give me a couple of the guests that you found the most interesting.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
Yeah, well, one of the guests I've got, which is a series 4 episode called The Unexpected, I talk to a genealogist who's been a genealogist for many decades called Elsa Churchill. She is the genealogist at the Society of Genealogists in London. And she talks about how her decades of researching her Churchill ancestors, and obviously she's got some British Churchills that she's very much aware of in history. Uh, she's researching her branch, and then she decides to take a DNA test, and that changed everything. From a genealogy point of view, it came back with an unexpected set of results that kind of opened up a whole new branch that she had no idea of. So it's an interesting episode from my point of view because this DNA has completely changed her family history research. It has given her this other branch to go research, but it's very different from my own background in that, I haven't been researching as long as she had, but I haven't had a DNA set of results that's changed the biological path I thought was correct.
Yeah, and that's
Uh,
interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah. So speaking to Elsa was very interesting. We also spoke in that series to a Swedish genealogist called Linda Kvist, and she talks about how she uncovered an ancestor who was believed to have died. He was a Swedish man, and he had gone to the US, and it was believed that he had gone to board the boat back to Sweden, and he died on the dock. And so everyone thought, he's dead, but, where on earth is he buried? And through her research, she discovers that he didn't die on the dock. He carried on living for several years in this kind of second or undead life that he had. So, all of these stories are fascinating to uncover, particularly when you find something very different like that.
Yeah, that is something. My cousin, who we for years, I mean, we didn't know who each other were, although we grew up not far from each other in New York.
Yeah.
Um, she found out that her grandmother, and she doesn't, all she knows is that she boarded the trip, she boarded the boat to Italy to go back home with her husband and never got back to Italy. And there's no record. I mean, you have to assume that she fell off the
Mhm.
ship, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
Died at
all.
sea, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all anybody really knows. And did she fall over? Did something else happen? Uh, they don't know. But DNA is interesting because Italians don't do a lot of DNA. So how about the British? That
Mm.
do they? Is it usual or unusual for them to do DNA testing?
I think it's quite common for the British to do DNA testing. We kind of, I think geographically, as an island that has invaded, colonized, but traded as well, and a very kind of geographical closeness to Europe and Scandinavia, but also lots of immigration to different countries as well. I think there's lots of British people who want to know how they are connected to the world around them, or how that world connects to them, I guess you could say. So I think it is quite common for British family historians to do DNA testing, and also because we're kind of in we're kind of central in Europe, we get a lot of American family history content as well. I think that helps with the different DNA tests too. So, we obviously get Ancestry, we get MyHeritage, 23andMe, Living DNA, Find My Past via them. So we get all of these different tests. So the family historians who I know here in the UK, I think, I don't think I know anyone who hasn't done DNA testing. And most of those, I would imagine, has probably done more than one test as well.
Yeah, I did too. I did Ancestry and I did
Yeah.
living DNA because I
Yeah.
figured since they were based in Europe, I would get more hits on the Italian. But the Italians don't do it, and I
No.
think I've talked to some of them because most of them, not most of, but a lot of them now, they're still living or still have ties to a town where their family lived three,
Yeah.
4, 500 years ago. So they could just go to the cemetery and find everybody.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the same for me. My family have lived in Cambridgeshire, which is a county in England, in the southern part of England, well, kind of Midlands of England. And they have been there for about 400 years. And then, there's a couple of branches that go to neighboring counties, but, it's not very far at all. It's 40 minutes in the car or something, and they don't stray very far. And so when I'm going through the parish registers looking for, say, my surname of Martin, I can look down the parish registers and I'm going, right, okay, paternal, 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 paternal. And in amongst them, I'll go, okay, maternal, paternal, maternal, paternal, maternal. They're all there together. They all knew each other, which is slightly alarming, but it's very easy from a family history point of view for me. And I think I'm very lucky in that respect.
Yeah, for sure. That, one of the easier things when you're researching Italian ancestors is that the women don't change their names. So
Okay.
even today, they don't take the husband's name. So it's
Okay.
it's it's easy in a lot of respects to do that. So the next section that you talk about is the life story. So what's your life story? What have you found interesting in your family going back 3, 4, 500 years?
Well, I have found rioters, which these are rioters in the early 19th century. They are rioting because of an increase in the cost of living, essentially, which right now is quite familiar. Or I don't know to the same respect, but as the topic is quite familiar, and it's a cost of living that's affected by the cost of food, by wages, and also environmental factors because of a volcano that erupts in Indonesia. So it's all kind of related to that. So I've got rioters. I've got several different rioters. There's also ones who riot about being undercut because they were silk weavers and they travel to a few villages away and destroy their silk looms and obviously end up going through the justice system for that. But yeah, so there's a lot of rioters, but I will behave, and there are other ones. One of the stories that I found in my tree is about my great grandmother, and it's one of those kind of demonstrations of the kind of fork in the road moments that we're presented multiple times a day in our daily lives. And she was one of about five children, or six in total, and her father died when she was about four, and her mother was pregnant with their youngest child. And this mother, a young widow with, five, soon to be six children, she had to make a decision. But thankfully, her married sister, lived in a town in Cambridgeshire called Littleport, and they had a big shirt factory that opened, and it was all new, being set up. And these people were advertising for, I think, respectable young ladies and women to come and work in the shirt factory, where they would be making shirts, making buttonholes, sewing on buttons, ironing, those kinds of things. And she just took that decision to go and move to the same place where her sister was living. And then her daughters, who were now kind of growing up, they were working in the shirt factory. And that shirt factory was a kind of a big employer in Victorian England. And the building is still there, but the factory is not, because the factory, which was called Hope Brothers, which is a beautiful name, it eventually got sold to Burberry's, which is still a brand today, which some of your listeners may be familiar with that fashion brand. And, it basically changed their lives. It brought income to women and girls in the area, in this kind of deeply rural Fenland area that would otherwise be domestic servants, housewives. It enabled them to have that independence and freedom and their own income. And so, it was a big decision that she made, but she did it, and it enabled her to have some independence, and her daughters too. And had she have not done that, then my great grandmother would not have met my great grandfather and got married in that town church, and I would not be here now.
Yeah, isn't that funny that how that works?
Yeah.
My grandfather was studying to be a priest, and
Mhm.
the story is that he was outside the seminary one afternoon, I guess, one morning, and my grandmother's carriage broke down because she came from a fairly well-off family. He helped repair the carriage. They gave him a ride someplace, and he left the seminary. Uh, and I, you know, I wish, one of the things, when you talk about brick walls and going back, one of the things I think that makes us all nuts is, is the story true? And I think about in my grandmother's case, because of the family that she came from, he was studying the priest, that they couldn't have been very happy about this marriage. My children are adopted, and I've been able to trace my daughter back to England, and she had some fascinating things, and one of them is she's a distant dispenser. But have you had anybody that has either ties to the States or gateway ancestors to the States? Have you run across that in your pursuits?
I have an unexpected one in that, and I don't know how many greats this is, so I'm going to say 5 greats. Could be wrong, but I think it's 5 greats. And I had this ancestor who was however many greats grandfather, and he goes missing. And I thought, oh, he's died. And, he kind of goes missing when he's about, I think, in his late 60s. And I was thinking, okay, he's died in the 1870s, 1880s, something like that. And he's vanished. I can't, maybe, I just haven't found the record. I haven't found the parish record, or he's just recorded in a random parish that I haven't yet looked at, or I've missed over it. So I was looking for him, and he had the name of James Simpson Bishop. However, sometimes he is Simpson Bishop, Samson Bishop, Sampson Bishop, Samuel Bishop, J Bishop, and JS Bishop. So very difficult to find the right one. And so there were lots of false positives. So I'd find someone else's ancestor and not mine. And then I spotted a passenger list. And this I should say that this 5 times great grandfather had at different times, he had a total of about 4 wives. And so he had lots of children, maybe 15 or 16 children in total. And his last marriage had taken him from the Fenland county of Cambridgeshire in kind of the South Midlands of the UK, and it had taken him up to the cotton mill industry in Lancashire. So lots of employment opportunities, but lots of hard work as well, and dangerous work as well in the cotton mills. And he's had this marriage to this 4th wife, and she turns up in the censuses and he doesn't. And that's why I thought he had died. But interestingly, when I kept looking at this, I then realized that she said that she was married and he was missing. So I looked for all of the children and tried to kind of document where they were going. And I spotted that the oldest daughter from the first marriage had emigrated to the USA. And accompanying them was him. He was there. The father was with them. So, this daughter had got married. She'd had about 2 or 3 children by that point, and they'd gone over to the US. And he'd gone with them. I was watching to see whether he would come back, and I didn't find it. And I noticed that by about 1901, or maybe the 1891 census, one of those two, the 4th wife then says widow on her census return. And I thought, okay, is this a case of, the 7 years separation, so she can kind of say that it's a divorce, because divorce would still be quite difficult at that point to get. So she's just said widow to kind of accept the end of that, or has he actually died and she is the widow? And what I found was that he had been in the US for long enough that he naturalized in his late 60s in 1886, I think, something like that. And yeah, he was there, and I think they were in Illinois somewhere. I can't remember the exact place name, but he was there, and he was there with the older daughter and her family. And so I like to think that I have an American five times great grandfather, which is kind of fun to say because it's very different from the fenland life that he would have known and that a lot of his children know, because I descend from his oldest child from his first marriage who stayed in those fenland villages. So it's fun to say that I have this American five times great grandfather.
Yeah, I see, and that's what I'm talking about. Why did he go? Did he have a fight with his wife? Did the daughter convince? It's so interesting when you
Yeah,
have that kind of stuff.
I mean, yeah, and it may well have been that their relationship ended. They just got to the end of their relationship, and he went with the daughter, and she stayed with the youngest of the children because the oldest of the children were, getting married and having their own children by now. Or did he go with her for a while, travel with this daughter for a while, and intend to come back, but actually thought, no, I'm going to stay here and naturalize, because that's obviously an indicator of intent to stay, is to have been there for however many years it is. I can't remember how many it is, and to naturalize. I've seen the document, and yeah, I wonder whether their relationship just failed. They couldn't afford a divorce, so they kept apart for a number of years, and she stayed in Lancashire until she died. So
That's such a great story. Such a great story. So now the last section that you kind of do before you go in the time machine is the brick wall. So I'm going to ask you, do you have a brick wall?
yeah, I do. I actually have done, because my podcast has a time machine. I was able to engineer a situation where I was a guest on my own podcast. And for this one episode, the time machine, in the previous episode, right in the last few moments, the time machine goes wrong. And it somehow flips me into like a kind of alternate version where where I'm now the guest on this podcast. And I've got this guest host, Dr. Vanda Vyporska. She is the host in this alternate version of reality. And so she interviews me as the guest. So in this episode, which is called The Rioter, she talks to me, and I've revealed my brick wall. And my brick wall is one that has been bugging me for, I don't know, 15 years perhaps. And it's one where I really want to kill off my however many greats, again, sorry, I forgot, but however many greats grandmother, and her name's Mary Clark. And the reason I am so desperate to kill her off is because she played the archetypal wicked stepmother to her husband's children. And there's lots of very long court reports where these children, who were only kind of 7 and 8, about that kind of age, they're standing up in court, undoubtedly with her in the room as well, and giving evidence to say just how she was physically abusive to them. So how she would push them to the floor, and how she would not give them food, and how her children would be treated well. And these would be the children that she had with their father. So she was his second wife. So those children would be treated very well, but his children from his first marriage were treated very poorly. So it is simply because she is such a horrible piece of work that I am desperate to kill her off.
That's Cinderella. That's like, it sounds like it's right out of this. That's unbelievable. So about what year was that when they had to go to court?
Well, I smelt a rat in about kind of 1841, when I could find the children, and they were scattered in workhouses and houses of industry, which was kind of the support system in England at that time. So if you were poor or you were unwell, you went into the workhouse, and if you were a child, you were kind of taught different skills. So these children start turning up there, and I was thinking, oh, why are they not with their parents? And then I find their father, and I find the mother, and the mother is my ancestor, this wicked stepmother, and she's in the jail in Ipswich in Suffolk in England, and she's there with her youngest child, And so I was able to then track back to find this big newspaper report with the court appearance, and it is a big report. And I was able to then find the kind of jail admissions book as well, a scan of that. And it showed that she was sentenced to, I think, 6 months, and 2 months of that was with hard labor. So that would have been rightly horrible for her to go through. But because she had this small child, I think her name was Emily, who was just a few months old, the child had to go there as well. So, a very odd start to Emily's life, but she had to be with her mother to make sure that she got the care that she needed, I guess, whilst her mother was imprisoned and receiving hard labor. The father, who was guilty too for neglect, he was going to prison for, I think, only about 2 months, and like 1 month of that was hard labor. So he, despite being the father and him being found guilty of neglect, he got off rather lightly, really.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because you don't think about that happening, almost 200 years ago, that they put people in jail
No,
for things like that. That's really something. And
yeah,
sad, like you said.
and thankfully they did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Boy, that's some story. But yeah, like I said, when you were talking about it, I kept thinking about it. She's Cinderella's mother or stepmother, right? Maybe she was the prototype. I don't know who wrote the story or who wrote the book, but maybe there must have been more women like that, I guess, or whatever back then.
Well, yeah,
Because
yeah, I'm sure it wasn't unique.
yeah, because a lot of women died in childbirth, or there was lots of other stuff going on, and
Yeah.
men would marry just to have somebody to watch, to take care of the kids and things like that. Um, so
Yeah, and it kind of gets exposed because the villagers where they lived, they kept seeing the children from this first marriage around the village in rags. And I think one of them in the court describes them as kind of living skeletons, and they would see them around the village in all weather. So they approached them and asked them what was wrong. And so these girls very bravely told them what was wrong, and obviously then had to go through the court and recount it all. But yeah, I mean, she rightly went to prison, absolutely, and that's why I'm desperate to kill her off, because she's just a nasty bit of work. I'm not proud of her at all.
no, yeah, I have a couple of those in mine way back. Through my grandmother's family, my paternal grandmother, and those people who was killing off who, and whose brother was murdering who, and all this kind of stuff. Some advice for people starting out. What would you suggest to people who are just starting out doing their own research?
When I started out, I was a teenager, and a late teenager, and that was in a time where we had dial-up internet, and we had lots of telephone directories, and people wrote letters. So the place that I started was writing letters to distant relatives and quizzing my parents as to what they knew. And even if they just knew a little tiny bit, I would write that down. So write down everything and contact those distant relatives. And I found that if I wrote to the distant relatives, and by this I mean kind of second cousins, great aunts, great uncles, that kind of distance. And if I wrote to them, I would nearly always get a reply. I would draw a family tree as much as I knew for their bit of the family and send it to them, because I learned that if you present some wrong information to not intentionally, but if you send some wrong information to a distant relative, they're going to write back and say, no, actually it's this. And they're giving you gold at that point. That's what you want. You want to be corrected with the facts that they're going to give you. But sometimes they would also give you photographs. And sometimes those photographs would be of your close relatives, because those people would be distant. And this may be from a time where they had photographs taken, and then they would send them out to their cousins or their great aunts who were perhaps living away, or perhaps just they didn't see them very often. but they would be from your close relatives, and they might be pictures of your close relatives. So it was very useful for kind of getting photographs and getting trees corrected and giving you more clues to then research in the archive. So I would, whilst the dial-up days with the bleeping modems and are kind of behind us, as affectionate as I am to them, but yeah, I'm glad we're past that. Uh, whilst you've got these distant relatives around you, write to them, because whilst you're going to get this family history information and these photographs, it's going to be really good. But I also found that it also, in my opinion, helped to kind of bring the family closer, because, you know, time can allow families to drift apart, and, you know, maybe a grandparent dies and you lose track of their nieces and nephews, or you know, their siblings' family, basically. But if you can identify them and write to them, it can help bring them back together again. And then you might get kind of a collective approach to doing your family history.
Yeah, and that's what happened to me with my cousin Linda, because she had photographs of my dad's family that I had never seen.
Yeah.
But what possessed you as a teenager to embark on this journey?
Well, a whole ton of curiosity, but that's because I came home from school one day, obviously living at home at this time as a teenager. I came home from school one day and there was a piece of paper on my parents' dining table, and it had, I recognized it straight away as a family tree. And I was looking at it and it said Martin family. And I looked at it and I thought, why is this guy married to not my grandmother? And then I started looking at it a bit more, and I was thinking, well, I don't recognize any of these people on this piece of paper. Who are they? And so I asked my mother, and she said, oh, yeah, your uncle came round. This is my dad's brother came round, and he brought this family tree, and these are all your relatives. And from that moment on, I thought, well, I'm going to find out who all those people are. And on that
So
tree were my great grandparents, one of whom was the person who I just told you about moving to the shirt factory. She was on there, and I had no idea what her name was, and yet she was my great grandmother.
yeah, see, these things don't happen by accident. There was a reason for him to come there with
No.
that tree, so you could find everybody else.
Yeah.
Isn't that funny how that
Yeah.
stuff works
Yeah,
out?
absolutely. Yeah.
It's
Been addicted
really
since.
no, I know. We all get there's one or two of us loonies in every family that has to find out all of this stuff, which I think is good, because I truly believe that there's, I don't know, force or whatever, but they want to be found. I really truly
Yeah.
believe that. I don't know why, but that's the way I feel. So this has been great, Andrew. I appreciate it. So where can people find, once again, where can people find the podcast? And for those listening who haven't heard it yet, I'm going to be coming on soon, right?
Yes, you are. There's a spoiler there, Bob. Yes, you will be in the new series, and I'm looking at the first week of November for series 8. That seems to, it's on target for that. So I think will be the first week of November 2024, and we'll be going live with season 8. And the best place to find it, if you go to familyhistoriespodcast.com, then you'll find all the latest updates. You can hear all of the previous episodes. You know, this will be our 8th series. We've released episodes with 49 different guests so far. So, you know, we'll be adding another 7 to that soon. So they're mounting up. So there's plenty of episodes for people to listen to on different topics. And we have guests who talk about family history from loads of different countries around the world with different backgrounds. So yeah, hopefully they'll enjoy it.
And I like the way you have an index too, because you have keywords for different things to be able, whether it's by country or whether it's by different categories that people could hone in on and find something great to listen to. Well, thanks again, Andrew. I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been fascinating. You know, like you, I love to hear these stories.
It's been an absolute joy, Bob, to take part in this podcast, and for you to very kindly invite me on without any Italian ancestry that I know of yet. But I will let you know if I find any.
There's got to be a Roman back there somewhere.
Well, I've got lots of Scandinavian DNA, so I'm not too sure about that. Maybe some Vikings. Maybe that's where the rioting comes from. I don't know, but my Viking blood. But yeah, no Italians yet, I'm afraid.